How long do plaster slip casting molds last? Our plaster molds are a tool in making our slip cast pots, and like many tools, they have an expected lifespan. I was curious about how long my molds lasted, so I started doing a test a good while ago. So as I've been slip casting my pots, I've also been marking them to see how many times I've used them. Some of them are very new and I've only used once, and this one here I have used a whole bunch. This is a little bit of a natural experiment, basically just using these in the wild, and there's going to be variations between these molds, but I think it gives a sense of how long these molds last. I think first it's good to talk about what does it mean for a mold to wear out. In my experience, I have basically one of two symptoms. This is actually my oldest mold, and it's before I started recording them. This is actually made with the very first version of Shapecast. There are some artifacts in here from me using Blender originally. And I've mostly retired this mold. I don't use it very much anymore. But one of the artifacts I get is actually a surface texture in the pot itself. So this one, the plaster has eroded the surface of the plaster. It's going to be hard to see, but I actually have a texture here on the surface that wasn't there originally. Basically, as the plaster has been used, it's been eroded some. And here is a bone dry pot, and you can see how that surface has transferred into the pot itself. The other problem I get from time to time is that the slip cast pot does not release and pull from the mold at the same time as the rest. So for instance, I'm slip casting two pots and I'm basically doing them at the same time. I dump out the excess slip, I let them sit and dry for a while, and then when I go to demold them, one will come out just fine and the other one will be stuck in its mold. So for one reason or another, it's not releasing. This could be from a couple of different things. One is it could be that there is some surface texture on there and it's grabbing on, basically creating undercuts. The other part of this may be that the plaster itself is not absorbing the water as well, and therefore the pot hasn't shrunk as much because there's still more water in the clay and less in the plaster itself. In both cases, these solutions are addressable. So in the case of the surface texture on the pot itself, one is it may not matter at all. Like this will be glaze, so most of these imperfections actually won't be there. And a good while ago, I saw something about too smooth of clay actually causing glaze application problems. If you're doing a raw clay application, that's probably be no good. But again, like these will be glazed, so it's probably not gonna be a problem. And of course, the other thing we can do is actually use a sponge. So when this is still wet, maybe it's leather hard, you can take a sponge and go over the surface. We need to do this over the rim anyways, because it winds up being cut when we pull it out of the mold. And so doing a quick pass over the surface of the pot isn't a huge deal. If you were doing a bunch of these, it would eventually add up. If you're only making a few, you can actually expand the life of the mold by just using the sponge. Likewise, for the ones that get stuck in there, basically all I need to do is let them wait longer. Instead of maybe taking 25 minutes to sit and release, maybe it can take as much as an hour. If you're doing production pottery, that would be problematic, but if you're just making a few pots here and there, it's manageable. So already we have a fuzzy answer as to how long a mold lasts, and it's because the nature of the problems we get can be worked around. Eventually, at some point, it's not worth dealing with these issues, and it just makes sense to make new molds. And luckily with the Shapecast mold system, the 3D prints can be reused as many times as you want, so it takes a lot of the tedious and annoying parts out of making the plaster molds away, and so that balance actually shifts. If making the molds is painful and annoying, then you probably want to babysit the molds and try and get them to have as much life as possible, potentially dealing with some of the clay issues. Whereas if they're easier, just go ahead and remake the mold. So I'm gonna go ahead and slip cast some pots, and I'm gonna show you some of these problems, and we can take a look at the mold counts that I've been doing, and we can see what the different pots look like. And then while we're waiting on the slip itself, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what's going on inside the plaster and where some of these problems originate from. All right, I've got my slip all mixed up. I keep it in this bucket here, and I have this rain spigot with a valve on it, so I can just dump the slip out. To start with, I have these two molds here, and this one has been used a lot, and this one has been used a lot but less, and so I think these will be a good comparison to each other. So I have several molds that are my tumbler form. One of these has a modified foot, and I have one more that is slightly smaller. So again, these have all been used at different amounts, and so it'll be good to kind of compare against each other. I should mention one of the other things that can cause a mold to go bad is if you're not careful, you can potentially chip the mold, or I was doing a workshop and someone went ahead and cut into my mold. That part's in the slip well, doesn't matter, but the rim here can be problematic. Basically, plaster doesn't like 90-degree corners. They can be rather weak. And so it is possible to chip things off, or you could potentially break the mold. But I'm mostly talking about just kind of normal wear. And another problem you can get actually straight away is bubbles in the molds. And I'll talk about bubbles more in a second, but some of them are larger. This is, again, isn't really wear and tear, but it does mean that the slip cast part requires some cleanup. I've gotten much, much better in my technique for mixing plaster, so I tend to have fewer bubbles. But shooting YouTube videos, I'm often not paying completely attention to the plaster making, and so sometimes they sneak in. This is my newest mold. It is tiny, and it's only been used once, so it's going to be a good example of a brand new mold. And then I have the big mold I talked about, and another mold I've had in retirement because it has worn out and it's showing some problems as well. So I'll go ahead and slip cast these. All right, there we have it, a whole bunch of plaster molds filled with slip. For my slip and my plaster, I need about 25 minutes to form the wall. Basically what's happening is the plaster is acting as a sponge, sucking the water out, and that's depositing the clay along the plaster walls. After the 25 minutes, I dump out the excess slip and let it dry. While the slip and the plaster are doing their thing, let's talk a little bit more about the plaster and why it can degrade. This here is the plaster I use. So it's made by the company USG, and it's #1 pottery plaster. Not all plaster is the same, and this plaster has been specifically formulated for slip casting. USG has a bunch of great data sheets and other technical information on their website about their plasters, and every time I go and read one of those, I learn something new about plaster. But this plaster here is the one specifically formulated for slip casting. And one of the things that makes it good for slip casting is that it's porous. So as I mentioned, the plaster is starting to suck the water out of the slip, and it's basically just a rigid sponge. There's a bunch of holes in here, like there's a bunch of holes in here. The plaster is actually a crystal, and obviously the sponge is not. That porosity, those holes, are small little cavities for the water to enter into. And we start with dry plaster, so if I had a dry sponge and I added water to it, it would suck the water up relatively quickly. So one of the differences between different types of plaster is basically how porous is it. So the plaster for slip casting is designed to be rather porous, so it can suck the water in relatively easily. However, it's also relatively weak. So there's a few different measures for how strong the plaster is. One is compressive strength, basically how hard you can push on it. Another is tensile strength, how hard you can pull on it. And there's also shear strength. Basically, if you try and move it sideways, how strong is it? Often you'll see the compressive strength in its largest number. Plaster can actually withstand a fair bit of force when you push on it. For slip casting, that doesn't matter, but if you're doing something like jiggering where you're pushing down, it does matter more. Or I guess maybe if you're doing a press mold. And this type of plaster is relatively weak on that scale versus other type of plaster. For instance, hydrocal is much stronger. And part of the reason hydrocal is stronger is, one, I think it's a different kind of crystal structure, although I'm not exactly sure, but it's also much less porous. So if you made the same plaster mold out of this stronger plaster, so it would be less prone to erosion just because it's fundamentally stronger, it would also absorb the water less well. I think some production molds are made with the stronger plaster just so they wind up being much more durable. But I think instead of waiting for 25 minutes like I do with my molds, these here, potentially you wind up waiting much, much longer. I haven't explored those other plasters much, but I do think that would result in a different level of durability. Basically, that kind of surface erosion I was talking about earlier, I think would be less with the stronger plasters. The other thing that impacts plaster strength is actually mixing it. Looking at the USG data sheets, it recommends mixing with the mixer, and it turns out that the strength of the plaster is proportional to how hard you mix it. I don't quite understand how or why that works. But when you're mixing up the plaster, if you're mixing it very gently, it winds up being much weaker. Versus me, and I use my drill and a paddle mixer, it's mixing much more vigorously, and that increases the strength of the plaster, so it's closer to what the manufacturer actually intended. But as far as I understand, this is the fundamental nature of the way plaster works. A lot of people are afraid of bubbles, so they'll actually mix their plaster by hand. They'll put in a little bit by hand and mix it around, but that's going against the manufacturer's recommendations, and what you're doing is you're creating much weaker plaster. So while you may not have introduced the bubbles, now the plaster is weaker and subject to these erosion problems much more strongly. Plaster will also absorb water from the air, so this bag, when it comes to me, is lined in plastic, and as soon as I open it, that means water from the air is starting to get into it and starting to affect the chemical composition. So old plaster can also result in weak plaster. I was doing some mold work with a local artist, and he had had some plaster sitting around for quite a while, and the first batch of molds did not work out well. Fresh plaster fixed that problem. And mixing air into the plaster is a problem. Even though I mix it with my drill, you have to be very careful to not pull bubbles into it. There are the large bubbles that will impact the surface quality and be obvious defects, but I think if there's a lot of small bubbles, that can contribute to the plaster eroding very quickly. Like if the bubble is just under the surface of the plaster, there's a very thin wall of plaster there, and it wouldn't take much basically to pop that bubble, and now we have a textured surface. And one of these molds here, I will show you, I've only used a handful of times and is already showing some problems. I'm pretty sure I didn't mix the plaster properly. Again, I'm kind of juggling a bunch of things making these YouTube videos, and so either I was mixing in too much air or I was using old bag of plaster. I'm not exactly sure, but that's my best guess. Another thing that can degrade the plaster molds is actually your deflocculant. If you're using sodium silicate, apparently that can be rather aggressive and actually eat away at the plaster structure itself. Darvan, which I use, is much gentler. It's one of the advantages it touts. So your slip itself can be eating away at the plaster molds. Likewise, in doing some research for this, even things like hard water, the minerals inside the water can migrate into the plaster and either start with the erosion, or the other thing is that since the plaster is a sponge, those pores that are inside the plaster can start to fill up. And that means that the plaster is absorbing the water less well. So while on the surface this looks relatively simple, there can be a bunch of things going on. All right, my molds have a little bit longer to go before I dump them out. I'll do that. We'll let them sit and dry, and then we'll demold, and we will compare the different surfaces of the different molds, and then we will compare the different pot surfaces and their respective mold counts. These have all sat long enough, so we'll just dump them back out, and I've pulled out my slip drainage table. There we go, they barely all fit. We'll be back in, again, another 25 minutes or so. For my regular molds, that's when the pot should be ready to be demolded. However, I'm expecting a few problems with some of these since they are starting to degrade. All right, these are all ready, except I need to go ahead and mark them all. And I should note that I am sure that I've missed some of these when I was slip casting, so these are undercounted if anything. Got a bunch of molds, so I'll go ahead and use my banding wheel. All right, so I've trimmed off the excess clay from the slip wheel, and there's one thing to note even at this point. So here is my newest mold, and if you look closely, it has slightly released. You can see there's a little bit of a gap, and it has sunk down just slightly. That's because the clay has started to shrink already because the water's going into the plaster mold. Grab a wear board. So that means this one I'm pretty sure is going to come straight out. Yeah, no problem. In contrast, this one here, I don't see that gap, nor has it shrunk down, it has fallen. And I'm guessing this is the one with the most. Yes, it is. Versus this one, I'm seeing a bit of a gap and it's starting to fall a little bit. That's the one with less. So this one probably won't come out and the other one should. So I think this is going to be the more promising one. Yep, no problem. And this one, yeah, it's stuck. So I'm gonna set it off to the side. I'm gonna go ahead and count how many are here. So 5, 10, 15. This one has 17. So I'm just gonna keep note here. This one I know is 2, but we'll write it down as well. So the old molds where I wasn't counting, I see the same problem. It hasn't released from the sides, hasn't dropped down at all, so I'm not going to even bother at this point. This one's looking the same. All right, then we have all of our tumbler forms. This one, and this one all look good, so I'm guessing they're going to come out. Yep, no problem. So this one here on the end that we did first is 7. This one's 5, 10, 15, 17. This one's 5, 10, 14. And the last smaller one is stuck as well, so we'll set off to the side. So these tumbler forms, we can already see some of the other degradations that are possible. So this one here has a bunch of bubbles in the surface. Right there, they're coming through. There's a bunch of bubbles there, all throughout the surface. And if we look down inside the mold, you may not be able to see them very well, but they are right there hiding. And when I first did this mold, I didn't notice those. So those have opened up since using the mold. So this one has 14 slip casts off of it. This one in contrast has 17, so a couple more. And it is still nice and clean. And likewise, looking down on the mold, it's still nice and smooth. And not too surprisingly, the newest mold looks just fine. So the difference in these two was likely in the mixing of the plaster. So this one degraded much faster, and this one's still holding on just fine. The other thing about this one here on the end is there were a couple of larger defects. So there's some larger bubbles in the plaster. And so we do have those defects here in the sidewall, but the overall surface finish of the pot is looking good. So it's a different type of bubble problem. These are usually the ones that are pretty obvious. I think the ones that are much smaller are the ones that are a little bit more devious and the ones that really degrade the mold quickly. So I'm gonna go ahead and give these another half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll come back and see if they've released. I have also persuaded these in the past, basically using my air compressor and an air gun to force air down in there, but that risks deforming the pot. So we'll just give them some more time. All right, 35 minutes later, these are now looking like they've pulled away. So let's try and demold them. Oh, there it came. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 34. This mold also has the edge that's been chipped out. It's kind of smoothed over at this point. And it's on the rim, so that's usually pretty easy to clean up, but that is another defect that can happen. And this one's still stuck. This bowl here is still stuck on the edge, but if you slightly move it, sometimes it'll release. I'm guessing no. I think our bowl might work. Yeah, it came. So this one's still soft, but you can see here again that texture in the outer wall, which is, I think, is what's grabbing on. Also, this one has relatively poor draft angles. It's rather vertical, which doesn't help. So I made a selection of relatively bad molds, so it's not surprising I'm having some problems. So let's go ahead and see if I can get these persuaded to come out. So back off camera, I have my air compressor and this air gun here, and it will blow. And so let's be very gentle. There we go, you can see it pop up. So basically the air pressure is going underneath and releasing whichever part that's stuck. And now it'll come. There we go. So I've been babysitting these molds for a while, but I think it is time to retire them. So how many slip casts can we get out of a mold? I think looking at this, the answer seems to be about 20. However, this pot back here came out of a mold with 34, and it's still holding on. The others, I have 17, they're doing just fine. I suspect I could get 20, 25 out of them, no problem. Some of them are younger, so this one's 15, and it had problems straight out of the gate. Basically, the first slip cast I made out of it, it was a bit problematic. And my bowls back here are definitely past their useful time, but you can still get pots out of them. So the answer to how long the molds last depends on a bunch of factors. One is how many problems are you willing to deal with? If you're a production potter, it totally makes sense to go ahead and remake your molds when they're nice and fresh and use them As soon as they start exhibiting any of these problems, for whatever reason, just pour more plaster. The effort needed in terms of cleaning up the pots is probably higher than the time it requires to make new plaster, and it's multiplicative. If I get 20 or 30 casts out of some plaster and I have to spend, say, a minute on each one cleaning it up that I wouldn't otherwise have to do, well, that's half an hour. Can I make a new mold in half an hour? Well, with Shapecast, you probably can. You probably would actually pour several molds at once. If you're making molds the more traditional way, then they are more precious, and remaking a mold is definitely much more of a pain, so it's worth dealing with some of these imperfections. The last factor has nothing to do with the plaster and more to do with you and your own preferences. These tall, narrow cups I actually made for my daughter, and once I had enough of those, I've kept making them, but I don't really have a need for them anymore. And my own tastes have evolved, and with Shapecast, it's really easy to make new designs, so I tend to get tired of a form faster than it actually wears out. And just as a quick example, this is the one with all the bubbles on the outside. It doesn't take much with the sponge to clean it up. This is still a little bit soft, or this one here with this two larger bubbles on the outside. A quick sponge does a pretty good job pretty fast. So if you're only spending 5 seconds on it, it probably is worth reusing it. And of course, your results may vary. Definitely comes down to your plaster technique, mixing your plaster well, both in terms of air bubbles as well as making it strong enough. Your actual plaster itself, is it soft plaster like this that's meant for slip casting, so it's really good at sucking the water out of the slip? Or is it a harder plaster that may be more durable, so therefore it'll last longer, but winds up taking much longer to slip cast in? I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks.